Imagine this for a moment. A dying man lies alone in a cold London room. His heart is failing, his strength is nearly gone, but with the very last drops of blood in his body, he drags his trembling fingers across the wall and writes only 3 words. 221B Baker Street. No explanation, no message, just the address of Sherlock Holmes. Why would a stranger spend his final breath writing Holmes's address in blood? And more importantly, what secret was so dangerous that he had to die to reveal it? That is exactly the mystery we are about to uncover. But before we begin, I want to know something about you, the brilliant minds watching this investigation unfold. If you enjoy solving mysteries and following Holmes's deductions, write in the comments. Where are you watching from, and how old are you? Holmes' Deduction Diaries has viewers from all over the world, and it's always fascinating to see which detectives are joining us tonight. So take a moment and comment your country and age, and let's begin tonight's mystery together. Chapter 1. The Settling of the Night. London had surrendered to the snow. It came softly at first, just after 4 o'clock, when the last gray light of afternoon still clung to the western sky, scattered flakes drifting through the yellow glow of gas lamps like fragments of a half-remembered dream. But as evening deepened, the snowfall found its confidence, thickening and slowing until every rooftop, every railing, every cobblestone on Baker Street lay beneath a fine and unbroken white. Behind the glowing windows of 221B, in the most famous sitting room in all of England, Dr. John Watson sat in his worn velvet armchair beside a generous fire. A medical journal lay open across his knee, though he had read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a word. His attention kept drifting, drawn away by the simple pleasure of the evening itself, by the warmth against his shins, the soft hiss of the coals, the occasional whisper of snow against the window pane behind him. Across the room, Sherlock Holmes reclined in his mouse-colored dressing gown, long legs stretched toward the hearth, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes were half closed, not in sleep, but in that peculiar state of restful alertness that seemed unique to Holmes alone, as though even in repose, some part of his extraordinary mind remained gently turning. Mrs. Hudson had built up the fire before retiring to her own quarters, and she had done so with her usual quiet expertise. Seasoned oak over deep amber coals, the flames moving with an unhurried, almost hypnotic rhythm. Every few moments a log would shift, releasing a soft crack and a brief shower of sparks that rose into the chimney's throat and vanished. Between the 2 men sat a tray bearing a teapot beneath a quilted cozy warm scones and bone china cups. The room carried the scents that defined it as surely as any address: pipe tobacco, old leather bindings, and the clean, dry smell of wood smoke that lived permanently in the curtains and carpet and walls. Watson lifted his tea and drank. Strong, hot, with just enough cream to soften the tannin. He held the cup a moment longer than necessary, letting warmth seep into his fingers. But Watson had learned, across years of extraordinary companionship, that the quietest evenings at Baker Street were often the ones that refused to stay quiet. The most remarkable cases had not arrived with drama or fanfare. They had slipped in through the fog, or climbed the 17 stairs on uncertain feet, or announced themselves with nothing more than a tentative knock upon the door. He did not know it yet, could not possibly have known, but this night would be remembered long after the snow had melted from the London streets. Before dawn broke over the city, he and Holmes would find themselves standing in a cold and shadowed room in Bermondsey, looking upon the still face of a dead man none of them had ever met, and reading a message written on the wall in the man's own blood. A message that bore their address, but that lay ahead. For now, the fire crackled its ancient wordless song. The snow fell in its patient curtain beyond the glass, and the clock on the mantelpiece ticked softly, steadily, marking the last peaceful minutes of an evening that was about to change. The sitting room of 221B Baker Street possessed, on evenings such as this, a quality that Watson had never quite found the proper words to describe. He had tried on occasion, in the pages of his private journal, that leather-bound companion which received his thoughts when no case occupied his pen. He had called it warmth, but that was insufficient. He had called it peace, but that fell short as well. It was something closer to the feeling one has upon returning home after a very long journey, when the door closes behind you and the familiar air of your own room settles around your shoulders like an embrace you did not know you needed. The mantelpiece above the fire held its usual collection of curiosities. The jackknife pinning a sheaf of unanswered correspondence to the wood, a small glass vial whose contents Watson preferred not to examine too closely, and the Persian slipper in which Holmes kept his tobacco. A brass carriage clock ticked at one end, its face reflecting the firelight in miniature, a tiny golden world turning steadily within the glass. Beside it, propped against a stack of monographs, sat a framed photograph of a country lane that neither man had ever explained to the other, though both seemed to find comfort in its presence. The bookshelves lining the far wall sagged gently under their burden. Volumes of chemistry and criminal history, anatomy atlases, bound editions of foreign newspapers, and a complete run of the agony columns clipped from the Times and arranged in Holmes's own peculiar system of classification. Watson's own contributions to the shelves were more modest. A few medical texts, a worn copy of Boswell's Life of Johnson, and a slim volume of Tennyson's poetry that he sometimes read aloud on quiet evenings, though Holmes professed to find poetry an inefficient use of language. The curtains had been drawn against the night. Heavy burgundy velvet, they absorbed the firelight and gave it back as a deep, rich glow that softened every edge and corner of the room. The carpet beneath Watson's feet, a Turkish rug of considerable age and debatable origin, was warm from the fire's reach, and he pressed his stockinged feet into it now with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has no intention of going anywhere. On the tray between them, the scones were cooling slowly, their steam diminishing to the faintest wisp. Watson reached for one, broke it open, and spread it with a careful layer of butter and honey. The butter melted instantly, soaking into the warm crumb, and the honey caught the lamplight as it dripped from the knife, a single golden thread connecting the blade to the scone before it broke and fell. Holmes had not moved. His breathing was slow and even, and from a distance one might have believed him asleep. But Watson knew better. He had seen this exact stillness many hundreds of times, and he knew it was not rest, but rather a particular form of concentration, a state in which Holmes withdrew from the external world in order to tend the vast and intricate filing system of his own mind. He was sorting, Watson imagined, rearranging, discarding what was irrelevant and polishing what might one day prove useful. Even now, with no case before him and no puzzle demanding his attention, the machinery of that remarkable brain turned on, as quietly and as ceaselessly as the clock upon the mantel. Watson ate his scone in comfortable silence, brushing crumbs from his waistcoat, and poured himself a second cup of tea. The fire murmured, the snow whispered, and the room held them both in its gentle amber light as it had on so many evenings before. Watson's Quiet Reflectio, N.S. Watson set his teacup down and let his gaze drift across the room, taking in the familiar landscape of their shared existence. How many evenings had he spent in this very chair, in this very posture, watching the firelight play across the cluttered surfaces of their sitting room? He could not have counted them even if he wished to. They had accumulated over the years like the layers of tobacco ash that Holmes was so fond of cataloging, each one indistinguishable from the last, and yet together forming something of surprising depth and substance. He thought about how rare this kind of stillness truly was. Holmes, by nature and by calling, was a creature of relentless motion. His mind demanded stimulation the way a furnace demands coal, and without a case to occupy him, the detective was prone to dark moods, chemical experiments of alarming volatility, and violin performances that could charitably be described as experimental. Watson had weathered all of these. He had learned to read the barometric pressure of Holmes's temperament with the same precision his friend applied to reading a crime scene, and he had developed his own quiet strategies for navigating the storms. But tonight, there was no storm. Tonight the barometer held steady, and Holmes seemed genuinely content to sit in silence, to let the evening pass without demanding anything of it. Perhaps it was the snow. Watson had noticed over the years that Holmes was not entirely immune to the influence of weather upon mood, despite his protestations to the contrary. Rain made him restless. Fog sharpened his focus. But snow, heavy, steady, blanketing snow, seemed to quiet something within him, as though the world outside had finally slowed to a pace his mind could tolerate without complaint. Watson savored the moment. He watched the snow drift past the window in its silent procession and felt, deep within his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was gratitude, he supposed. Gratitude for this room, this companionship, this unlikely life he had stumbled into on the day a mutual acquaintance had introduced him to a pale, sharp-eyed chemist who needed someone to share his rent. He allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that the evening might remain exactly as it was, uninterrupted, uneventful, perfectly and completely still. The belief was foolish, of course. He knew that. But it was a pleasant foolishness, and he held it gently, the way one holds a candle flame against a draught, knowing it will not last but enjoying its small warmth while it does. The clock ticked, the fire settled, and Watson closed his eyes, just for a moment, and let the peace of Baker Street wash over him like warm water. Holmes stirs. The silence broke gently, as silence in that room so often did, not with a crash or a declaration, but with the quiet, precise sound of Sherlock Holmes's voice. "The snow will stop within the hour, Watson." Watson opened his eyes. Holmes had not moved from his position in the chair, but his gaze had shifted to the window, where the heavy curtains parted just enough to reveal a narrow sliver of the night beyond. The snowflakes caught in that thin band of visibility drifted downward in their unhurried way, and Watson could not see anything in their behavior that might suggest an impending change. "You sound remarkably certain for a man who has not consulted a barometer," Watson replied, smiling. "I have no need of a barometer. The wind has shifted. You can hear it. A faint change in the pitch beneath the front door. It has moved to the northeast, which at this temperature and humidity will break the cloud cover within 40 minutes. The snowfall will thin, pause, and then resume more heavily around 3 in the morning." Holmes paused, and the faintest suggestion of a smile crossed his thin lips. "The barometer would merely confirm what the door has already told me." Watson laughed softly. It was such a perfectly Holmesian observation, the kind that transformed the mundane into the remarkable, that found meaning and pattern where others saw only weather. He had long since ceased to be astonished by these demonstrations, but he had never ceased to enjoy them. They were, in their own quiet way, one of the great pleasures of his life. "You cannot simply sit by a fire and enjoy the snow, can you?" Watson said, though his tone was affectionate rather than critical. Holmes considered this. "I am enjoying it, Watson. I am merely enjoying it with precision." A church bell tolled in the distance, faint, muffled by the snow, but distinct enough to count. 10 o'clock. The sound drifted through the winter air like a stone dropped into still water, its reverberations spreading outward in slow, diminishing rings until they were absorbed by the silence of the city. Watson listened until the last echo faded, and then there was only the fire again, and the snow, and the steady, companionable breathing of two men who had long ago learned that the finest conversations are sometimes the ones conducted almost entirely without words. Holmes's fingers tapped once against the arm of his chair, a single idle gesture, and then he was still again. The evening, it seemed, had settled into its final and most comfortable shape. The tea was cooling. The fire was banking slowly toward embers, and Baker Street lay quiet beneath its white December blanket. But somewhere out in that snow-covered city, in a narrow room above a chandler's shop in Bermondsey, an elderly man lay dying, and with the last of his failing strength, he was reaching toward the wall beside his bed, his fingers wet with his own blood, to write the only words that mattered to him now. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Arrival. The knock, when it came, was heavy and urgent. It struck the front door of 221B Baker Street with a force that carried clearly up the staircase and into the sitting room, cutting through the murmur of the fire and the whisper of the snow with the unmistakable authority of someone who believed their errand could not wait. Watson straightened in his chair. Holmes's eyes opened fully, and for a moment neither man moved. They simply listened, the way two men listen when they know, with the instinct born of long experience, that the quiet part of their evening has just ended. Below, they heard Mrs. Hudson's door open. Her footsteps crossed the entrance hall, quick but unhurried, for she too had grown accustomed to late-night visitors, and she had learned to receive them with the calm efficiency of a woman who understood that the work done in the rooms above her own was seldom governed by conventional hours. The front door opened. Cold air moved through the house. Watson felt it as a faint draft that stirred the curtains and made the fire flicker for just a moment. Voices murmured below, too low to distinguish, and then footsteps began to climb the stairs. Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, her expression carrying that particular mixture of disapproval and resignation that she reserved for interruptions after 10 o'clock. "A constable to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, "from Scotland Yard. He says it is a matter of some urgency." Holmes inclined his head. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps a fresh pot of tea if you would be so kind. The young man will be cold." She withdrew, and a moment later a young police constable stepped into the room. He was perhaps 25, with a broad, honest face now pale beneath the ruddy flush of the cold. Snow dusted his shoulders and the brim of his helmet, which he removed immediately upon entering, holding it before him with both hands in the manner of a man who has been taught to show respect in the presence of his betters. His boots left dark, wet prints on the carpet. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and his voice carried a faint tremor that was not entirely attributable to the cold. "I apologize for the hour, sir. Inspector Lestrade sent me personally. He said you would want to know about this straight away." Holmes gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. "Sit down, constable, warm yourself, and then tell us, as clearly and as calmly as you can, what has brought you through the snow at this hour." The young man sat. His hands, Watson noticed, were not entirely steady. Whatever he had seen tonight, it had shaken him. Not with fear exactly, but with that particular unease that comes from encountering something one's training has not prepared one to explain. Watson set aside his journal and leaned forward. The fire crackled softly, the snow went on falling beyond the window, and the constable, gathering himself with a visible effort, began to speak. The constable's account. "It happened in Bermondsey, sir," the constable began, and Watson noticed that his fingers had tightened around the rim of his helmet. "A lodging house on Cathcart Lane, just south of the river. Small place, respectable enough as far as those streets go. A chandler's shop on the ground floor, rooms to let above." Mrs. Hudson appeared with the fresh pot of tea. She poured a cup for the constable without being asked, and placed it in his hands with a gentleness that seemed to steady him. He nodded his thanks, drank, and continued. "An elderly man was found dead in one of the upstairs rooms this evening. The landlady, a Mrs. Bowen, she'd taken him in 3 days ago. He gave his name as Edwin Marsh and paid a week in advance. Quiet sort, she said. Kept to himself entirely. She only saw him the once when he arrived. He looked unwell then, she told us, but he was polite and caused no trouble. Holmes listened without moving, his gray eyes fixed upon the constable with that penetrating, unblinking attention that Watson had seen unsettle far more seasoned men than this young officer. Mrs. Bowen brought his morning tea at 7:30 and found the door unlocked. She knocked, received no answer, and went in. The man was lying on the bed, fully clothed, quite dead. She said he looked peaceful enough. No sign of violence, no disorder in the room. She would have assumed it was his heart or some natural failing, and likely so would we. The constable paused. He looked into his teacup as though searching for the right words in its amber depths. But there was something else, sir. Something written on the wall beside the bed. The fire popped. A log settled deeper into the grate. Watson felt the room grow imperceptibly stiller, as though the very air had leaned in to listen. He had written something in his own blood, Mr. Holmes. On the wallpaper, just above the level of the mattress, as though he had done it while lying on his side. The letters were careful, not scrawled or panicked, but deliberate. Steady even considering the means. And what did this message say? Holmes asked quietly. The constable looked up. His eyes met Holmes's, and in them Watson saw something that was almost awe. It said, 221B Baker Street, sir. Nothing else. Just the address. Your address. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of the earlier evening. It was something heavier, something that pressed gently against the walls of the sitting room and altered the quality of the firelight. Watson looked at Holmes and saw that his friend's expression had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that a casual observer would have noticed, but in the subtle tightening around the eyes, the slight forward inclination of the head, the almost imperceptible quickening of breath that Watson had learned to recognize as the first stirring of genuine interest. "Inspector Lestrade is at the scene now?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir. He's had the room sealed. Nothing has been touched. He asked me to tell you that he would be most grateful for your assistance, and that he has never seen anything quite like it in 20 years of service." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. He steepled his fingers once more and pressed them to his lips, and Watson could almost hear the machinery of that extraordinary mind engaging. Wheels turning, gears meshing, the vast engine of deductive reasoning beginning its slow and inexorable acceleration. "How very thoughtful of our unknown friend," Holmes murmured at last, and though his tone was calm, Watson detected beneath it a current of something that was almost reverence. To use his dying breath to send us an invitation, it would be churlish, would it not, Watson, to decline? Holmes rose from his chair with a fluid, unhurried motion that belied the sharpness Watson had seen ignite behind his eyes. The lethargy of the evening, that rare, contented stillness, had vanished entirely, replaced by a quiet, focused energy that seemed to straighten his spine and sharpen the angles of his lean face. He crossed the room to where his coat hung beside the door and lifted it from the hook with the practiced ease of a man who had performed this exact gesture 1,000 times before. "You mentioned the room was undisturbed," Holmes said, addressing the constable as he buttoned his coat. "The door was unlocked when the landlady entered. Were the windows secured?" The constable thought carefully. "The window was latched from the inside, sir. I checked it myself." "And the man's belongings? Did you observe anything of note in the room beyond the message on the wall?" "A small leather traveling case beside the bed, sir. Lestrade said it was not to be opened until you arrived." Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. "Lestrade grows wiser with the years. There may be hope for Scotland Yard yet." He turned to Watson. "Come, my dear fellow, I believe our quiet evening has found its purpose." Watson was already on his feet. He set aside his journal and reached for his own coat and hat, feeling that familiar quickening in his chest, not anxiety, but anticipation. It was the feeling that accompanied the beginning of every case, the sense that the ordinary world was about to peel back and reveal something hidden beneath its surface. He had felt it dozens of times, and it had never grown old. He pulled on his gloves and wound his scarf around his neck, pausing to check that his small medical bag was in its customary place by the door. Old habit. Watson never accompanied Holmes to a scene without it. Holmes wrapped his gray traveling cloak over his coat and placed his ear-flapped cap upon his head. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though the act of dressing for an investigation carried its own solemn significance. He picked up his magnifying lens from the desk, slipped it into his breast pocket, and turned to face the room one final time. The fire still burned. The tea tray sat undisturbed. The two armchairs faced each other across the hearth, like old friends continuing a conversation in their occupant's absence. "Shall we?" Holmes said, and held the door. Into the winter night. The cold struck Watson like a wall as they stepped through the front door of 221B and into Baker Street. After the warmth of the sitting room, the winter air felt sharp and clean and startlingly alive, filling his lungs with a brightness that chased the last traces of drowsiness from his body. His breath came in pale clouds, and the snow crunched softly beneath his boots as he descended the steps to the pavement. The street was transformed. Every surface wore a mantle of white, and the gas lamps cast their yellow light through the falling snow in soft, diffused halos that seemed to hover in the air rather than illuminate the ground. The railings along the pavement had become delicate white ridges. The rooftops opposite had vanished beneath smooth, unbroken drifts. Even sound had changed, muffled, softened, wrapped in cotton wool, so that the city seemed to have drawn a deep breath and held it. A hansom cab waited at the curb, its driver hunched beneath a heavy coat, a woolen scarf wound around the lower half of his face so that only his eyes were visible. Two dark points of patient watchfulness above the frost-rimed fabric. The horse stood quietly, its flanks steaming, its breath rising in slow, rhythmic clouds that caught the lamplight and turned briefly golden before dissolving into the night. The constable had arranged the cab before climbing the stairs, and Watson was grateful for the young man's foresight. They climbed aboard. The leather seat was cold at first, and Watson turned up the collar of his coat as the cab lurched gently forward and began its journey south toward the river. The wheels rolled almost silently through the snow, and the horse's hooves fell with a muffled, rhythmic patience that was oddly soothing, a slow, steady heartbeat carrying them through the sleeping city. Watson gazed out through the small window. London passed by like a scene from a painting. Snow-covered squares, darkened shop fronts, the occasional glow of a window where someone else was still awake in the vast, quiet hours of the night. A church spire rose against the heavy sky, its cross just visible above the roofline, dusted white. A solitary cat crossed the street ahead of them, leaving a delicate trail of prints that the snow would soon erase. Holmes sat beside him in silence, his face turned toward his own window, his expression unreadable in the passing lamplight. Watson did not speak. He understood that Holmes was already working, already constructing and discarding possibilities, already building the framework into which the facts of this strange case would eventually be placed. To interrupt that process would have been as unthinkable as interrupting a surgeon mid-incision. The cab crossed Westminster Bridge. Below, the Thames moved darkly beneath the snow, its surface catching occasional flickers of reflected light from the embankment lamps. And ahead, somewhere in the narrow streets of Bermondsey, a dead man waited in a cold room with Holmes's address written in blood upon his wall. Chapter 3. Arrival at the lodging house. The cab turned onto Cathcart Lane and slowed to a stop before a narrow, soot-darkened building wedged between a rope-maker's warehouse and a small public house whose windows were now shuttered and dark. The chandler's shop on the ground floor was closed, its display of candles and tallow barely visible behind grimy glass. Above, 2 stories of living quarters rose toward the low winter sky, their windows dark save for one on the upper floor, where a faint light flickered behind thin curtains. Watson stepped down from the cab and looked up at the building. It was old but not derelict, the sort of respectable, hard-working establishment that served the clerks and laborers and widows who made up the quiet populace of this part of London. The brickwork was worn but sound. The front step had been swept recently, though the snow now covered it in a fresh layer of white. A hand-painted sign beside the door read, "Rooms to let, inquire within," in faded black lettering. Inspector Lestrade stood in the doorway, a bull's-eye lantern in one hand, his sharp, ferret-like face drawn tight with a mixture of puzzlement and relief at the sight of Holmes descending from the cab. Snow had accumulated on the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his overcoat, suggesting he had been standing there for some time, perhaps waiting, perhaps simply reluctant to return upstairs to the room and its unsettling message. "Holmes," Lestrade said, and the single word carried more gratitude than a longer speech might have conveyed. "Thank you for coming. I wouldn't have troubled you at this hour if it weren't. Well, you'll see for yourself." "You were quite right to send for me," Holmes replied, mounting the step and pausing to examine the doorframe with a brief, sweeping glance that took in the lock, the hinges, and a small scratch near the handle that might have been nothing at all. "A man writes my address in his own blood as his final act upon this earth. That is not a matter one postpones until morning." The air inside the entrance hall was cold and smelled of tallow, a thick, waxy scent that seemed to seep up from the chandler's shop below and permeate every surface. A narrow staircase rose steeply before them, its wooden treads worn smooth by years of ascending and descending feet. The wallpaper in the hallway was faded but clean, a pattern of small blue flowers on a cream ground that had once been cheerful and was now merely tired. Lestrade led them upward, his lantern casting long, swaying shadows on the stairwell walls. Watson followed Holmes, his medical bag in hand, and the young constable brought up the rear. The stairs creaked softly beneath their combined weight, and from somewhere deeper in the building came the sound of a clock ticking, slow, steady, indifferent to the business of the night. The room was small, sparsely furnished, and very cold. A single bed stood against the far wall, its iron frame painted white, its coverlet thin, but neatly arranged. A washstand occupied the corner nearest the door, bearing a chipped basin and a folded towel. A wooden chair sat beneath the window, and beside the bed, a small deal table held a water glass, an extinguished candle in a brass holder, and nothing else. The man on the bed lay on his back, fully clothed, his hands resting at his sides. He was elderly. Watson estimated his age at 70 or perhaps a year or two beyond, with a weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. His hair was white and thin, combed back from a broad forehead. His expression was peaceful, almost serene, as though death had come not as an enemy, but as a long-expected visitor whom he had finally agreed to receive. He wore a dark woolen suit of modest but respectable quality, a white shirt buttoned to the throat, and well-worn boots that had been recently cleaned. A plain brown overcoat lay folded at the foot of the bed. Everything about his appearance spoke of a man who took care with his person, a man of dignity, if not of means. Watson looked at the wall. The words were written just above the level of the mattress, on a section of faded wallpaper within arm's reach of where the man's right hand now rested. The lettering was approximately 4 inches high, rendered in a deep brownish red that had already begun to darken as it dried. The characters were remarkably clear, not elegant, but deliberate, each letter formed with the careful concentration of someone who understood that this message would need to be read and understood by others. 221B, Baker Street. Nothing else. No name. No explanation. No plea for help or accusation of wrongdoing. Simply an address. Holmes's address, inscribed in the most permanent and desperate ink available to a dying man. Holmes stood in the doorway for a full minute without entering the room. Watson had seen him do this before. This initial comprehensive survey conducted from the threshold, as though he were photographing the entire scene with his eyes before allowing his presence to alter it in any way. His gaze moved slowly across every surface, every object, every shadow, and Watson knew that in those 60 silent seconds, Holmes was absorbing more information than most men would gather in an hour of careful examination. When at last he stepped forward, he moved with extraordinary care, placing his feet precisely, avoiding the areas nearest the bed and the wall where evidence might lie. He approached the dead man and looked down at him with an expression that Watson could only describe as respectful attention. The gaze of a man who understood that this stranger had entrusted him with something and who intended to honor that trust completely. "A good face," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "An honest face." This was not a man given to theatrics, Watson. Whatever drove him to write our address in his own blood, it was not madness. It was purpose. Holmes produced his magnifying lens from his breast pocket and began his examination with the dead man's hands. He lifted the right hand gently, turning it beneath the lantern light, studying the fingers, the nails, the creases of the palm. Watson watched from a respectful distance, noting how Holmes's own long fingers handled the dead man's with a delicacy that bordered on tenderness. "Observe the hands, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "The skin is rough and deeply weathered. There are calluses here, across the base of each finger, and here, on the heel of the palm. These are not the hands of a clerk or a shopkeeper. These are hands that have worked the earth, that have dug and planted and pruned for many years. A gardener, or perhaps a groundskeeper. The soil of a lifetime does not wash away entirely, and you can see beneath the fingernails a faint darkness that is not blood, but earth." He set the hand down carefully and moved to the left wrist, where he paused, lens hovering, for a long and silent moment. Watson leaned closer and saw what had caught Holmes's attention. A faint mark encircling the wrist, a thin line of slightly discolored skin. "He wore something here," Holmes said. "A bracelet or a strap of some kind, worn consistently over many years. It has left a permanent impression, yet there is nothing on his wrist now, and nothing of that description among his visible possessions." Holmes straightened and turned his attention to the message on the wall. He examined the lettering closely, his lens moving along each character with painstaking slowness. He leaned near enough to smell the dried blood, then withdrew and studied the angle of the writing relative to the bed. "He wrote this lying on his right side," Holmes announced. "The angle of the strokes confirms it. He was already too weak to sit up, but his hand was steady, remarkably steady. This man knew he was dying, Watson, and he chose to spend his final reserves of strength on this single act of communication. That suggests a clarity of purpose that is both admirable and deeply significant." He moved next to the bedside table. The water glass received his attention for nearly a minute. He held it to the light, examined its rim, and set it down. The extinguished candle was studied with equal care. Then he knelt beside the bed and examined the floor, moving his lens slowly across the worn boards near the window, near the door, beneath the washstand. "Lestrade," Holmes said without looking up. "Has anyone entered this room since the landlady discovered the body?" "Only myself, the constable, and the police surgeon," Lestrade replied. The surgeon confirmed death and estimated it occurred sometime in the early hours of the morning. He found no marks of violence. Holmes nodded, still studying the floor. His gaze settled on something near the foot of the bed, a small leather traveling case, brown and well-worn, with brass clasps that had been polished recently. He reached for it, then paused and looked at Lestrade. "You have not opened this?" "I have not. I thought it best to wait." "Quite right," Holmes said softly. "Quite right indeed." What Lestrade knows. Holmes rose from the floor and turned to face Lestrade, brushing a fleck of dust from his knee. The inspector stood near the doorway with his arms folded, his sharp eyes following Holmes's every movement with the particular attention of a man who knows he is watching a master at work, even if professional pride prevents him from saying so. "Tell me everything you have gathered," Holmes said. "From the beginning." Lestrade consulted a small notebook he drew from his coat pocket. "The deceased registered here 3 days ago on Tuesday evening. He gave his name as Edwin Marsh, paid a week's rent in advance, 3 shillings, in coin. The landlady, Mrs. Bowen, described him as elderly, thin, and unwell. He had a persistent cough, she said, and walked with the slow deliberateness of a man conserving his strength. She offered to send for a doctor, but he declined. Did he say where he had come from? He did not. Mrs. Bowen said he volunteered nothing about himself beyond his name. He carried only that small traveling case you see there. She showed him to this room, brought him a pot of tea, and did not see him again until she found him this morning. No visitors, no correspondence, none that anyone observed. The chandler who keeps the shop below lives elsewhere and locks up at 6 each evening. The only other tenant is an elderly widow on the floor below, who is quite deaf and noticed nothing. Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the figure on the bed. 3 days, he murmured. He arrived on Tuesday. He died, by the surgeon's estimate, in the early hours of this morning, Friday. 3 days in this room, alone, with whatever knowledge compelled him to travel here and write my address upon the wall. 3 days during which he might have sent a letter, hired a messenger, or walked to Baker Street himself. And yet he did none of those things. Perhaps he was too ill, Watson offered. Perhaps, Holmes agreed. Or perhaps he was waiting for something, or watching for someone. He paused. We shall see. He knelt once more beside the traveling case and, with gentle hands, unfastened the brass clasps. The leather was old, but well cared for, oiled and supple, despite its years of use. The clasps opened with a soft click that sounded, in the stillness of that cold room, unexpectedly loud. Holmes lifted the lid of the traveling case and laid it open upon the floor. Inside, the contents were arranged with a neatness that spoke of long habit, each item occupying its designated place as though the case had been packed and unpacked hundreds of times in exactly the same way. A change of clothing lay folded on top, a clean white shirt, carefully pressed, and a pair of woolen socks darned at the heel with small, precise stitches. Beneath these, Holmes found a well-worn Bible bound in soft black leather. Its pages were edged with gold that had faded to a dull amber, and the spine was creased with the evidence of frequent reading. Holmes opened it carefully, and a pressed flower fell into his palm. A small, delicate bloom of pale purple, its petals papery and translucent with age, preserved between the pages of the Book of Psalms. He held it to the lantern light without comment, and set it aside with care. Beneath the Bible lay a railway timetable, a Bradshaw's, creased and annotated in pencil. Holmes turned its pages slowly, his lens hovering over the pencil marks, which appeared beside certain departure times from a station Watson did not immediately recognize. Holmes's lips moved faintly as he read, but he said nothing yet. Next came a small brass pocket watch on a simple chain. Holmes lifted it and held it close. The watch had stopped, its hands frozen at 23 minutes past 2. The case was plain but well maintained, and when Holmes turned it over, Watson saw an engraving on the back. The letters were worn but legible, etched in a formal, old-fashioned script. Holmes read the engraving silently, and something shifted in his expression. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps of confirmation, as though a suspicion had just been verified. At the very bottom of the case, beneath a square of folded tissue paper, lay a sealed envelope. It was unaddressed, no name, no postmark, nothing written on its surface at all. Holmes held it up to the lamplight, turning it slowly, examining the seal, the weight, the quality of the paper. Then, With a penknife drawn from his pocket, he slit the envelope open along its top edge and withdrew a single sheet of paper. It was a hand-drawn map. Watson leaned closer and saw a careful rendering of what appeared to be a country estate. A large house at the center, surrounded by gardens, outbuildings, and a boundary wall. Paths were marked with dotted lines. Trees were indicated by small circles. One section of the house, a wing extending from the eastern side, had been marked with a small, emphatic cross in dark ink. No names appeared anywhere on the map, no legend, no title, no indication of where this estate might be. Holmes studied it for a long, silent moment. Then he folded the map carefully, placed it in his breast pocket alongside the magnifying lens, and rose to his feet. "Thank you, Lestrade," he said quietly. "You were right to send for me. This man came a very long way to find us. The least we can do is discover why." Chapter 4. Returning to Baker Street. The cab carried them back through the pre-dawn streets in a silence that felt, to Watson, almost sacred. Holmes sat perfectly still, his chin resting upon his chest, his eyes open but focused on some interior landscape that Watson could not see and would not have presumed to enter. The map, the watch, the Bible, the pressed flower. Each piece of evidence was being weighed and sorted in that extraordinary mind, fitted and refitted into patterns that would eventually, Watson knew, resolve themselves into a coherent picture. The snow had stopped, just as Holmes had predicted. The clouds were beginning to thin, and here and there a star appeared, faint and cold, but present, like a promise kept. The streets they passed through lay pristine and untouched beneath their white covering, and the cab's wheels cut two dark, clean lines through the snow that stretched behind them like the tracks of their journey home. Watson watched the city pass. A baker's shop on the corner of Southwark showed a light in its upper window, someone rising early to begin the morning's bread. The smell of yeast and flour drifted briefly through the cab's window, warm and impossibly comforting, and then it was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of frost. A night watchman stood beneath a lamp, stamping his feet, his breath visible in slow, rhythmic puffs. They crossed the river again. The Thames lay dark and quiet below, its surface smooth and black as polished slate, reflecting the scattered stars and the distant glow of the embankment lights. A single barge sat motionless midstream, its cargo hidden beneath a canvas sheet dusted with snow. Neither man spoke. The horses' hooves beat their steady, muffled rhythm against the snow-packed road, and the cab swayed gently, almost soothingly, as it carried them northward through the sleeping city. Watson felt the strange, liminal calm that always accompanied the small hours, that sense of existing between one day and the next, of moving through a world that belonged, for a few brief hours, to no one at all. They arrived at Baker Street just as the first pale suggestion of dawn touched the eastern sky. Not color yet, merely a lightening, a softening of the darkness that promised morning without yet delivering it. The fire in the sitting room had burned low but not out, and the embers still glowed with enough warmth to take the chill from the room as they settled back into their chairs. Tea and early deductions. Watson knelt before the hearth and coaxed the fire back to life, adding kindling, and then a fresh log that caught quickly and sent a new cascade of warmth into the room. The familiar crackle and hiss was deeply welcome after the cold of Bermondsey and the long, silent ride home. He filled the kettle from the jug on the sideboard and set it on the hob, then settled into his chair to wait for it to boil. Holmes, meanwhile, had cleared a space on the table, pushing aside a stack of newspapers, a collection of glass slides, and a half-finished monograph on the identification of cigar ash, and spread his findings across its surface. The hand-drawn map occupied the center, smoothed flat and anchored at each corner with whatever was nearest. A magnifying lens, an inkwell, a teaspoon, and a small geological specimen that served, on ordinary days, as a paperweight. Beside it, he placed the railway timetable, open to the annotated page, and the sealed envelope from which the map had been drawn. The kettle whistled. Watson made the tea, strong, with a generous measure for the pot, and carried 2 cups to the table. Holmes accepted his without looking up, wrapping his long fingers around the warm porcelain and drinking absently as he studied the map. "Let us begin with what is certain," Holmes said at last, his voice quiet and measured, the voice of a man arranging his thoughts into precise order. The dead man, Edwin Marsh, was a gardener or groundskeeper by profession. His hands told us that beyond any doubt, decades of manual work in soil and weather have left their permanent signature upon his skin. Watson nodded, sipping his tea. "The pocket watch bears an engraving," Holmes continued. He produced the watch and turned it over, angling it toward the firelight so that Watson could read the inscription on its back. The letters were small and worn, but Watson made them out. "For faithful service, Hartwell House." "Hartwell House?" Watson repeated. "A private estate?" "Almost certainly." The engraving suggests a long period of employment, the sort of formal recognition given to a servant who has devoted a significant portion of his life to a single household. This watch was not an expensive item when new, but it was given with respect, and it has been carried with pride. Holmes turned to the Bible and opened it to the page where the pressed flower had been found. He lifted the bloom with tweezers and held it once more to the lamplight. "Meadow crane's bill," he said. "Geranium pratense, a wildflower common to chalk grasslands in the southern counties, particularly Hampshire, Wiltshire, and parts of Dorset. It blooms in summer and is frequently found along the margins of country estates where the land has not been heavily cultivated." "Hampshire," Watson said, watching the connection form. "Now observe the railway timetable." Holmes turned the Bradshaws toward Watson and indicated the pencil marks. "These annotations mark a specific departure, the 9:15 from a station called Hartwell Cross on the branch line south of Winchester, a small station serving a small village. Our Mr. Marsh came from Hampshire, Watson. He came from a place called Hartwell Cross, where he served for many years as groundskeeper of an estate called Hartwell House, and he carried with him a map of that estate, a pressed flower from its meadows, and a watch engraved with its name." He paused and drank his tea, his eyes distant, the firelight playing across his angular features. "He came to London with a purpose," Holmes said softly. "And whatever that purpose was, it mattered enough to him that he undertook the journey despite being gravely ill. He died before he could reach us, Watson, but he made certain, with the last strength in his body, that we would come to him." Holmes lifted the pocket watch once more and examined it under the magnifying lens, turning it slowly, studying not just the engraving but every scratch, every mark, every faint indication of the life it had accompanied. The watch had stopped at 23 minutes past 2, a detail that Holmes appeared to find significant, though he did not immediately explain why. "The mechanism is not broken," he said after a long examination. "The mainspring is intact. This watch stopped because it was not wound. Our Mr. Marsh, who had clearly maintained this timepiece with devoted regularity for years, look at the polish on the case, the clean condition of the winding crown, simply ceased to wind it. I believe this happened on the night he died. He knew, Watson. He knew that his time was ending, and at some point during his final evening, he allowed the watch to run down." Watson felt a quiet heaviness settle in his chest. It was a small detail, a watch left unwound, but it carried an enormous weight of meaning. It spoke of acceptance, of a man who understood what was happening to him and chose to face it with the same steady, practical dignity that had characterized his final message on the wall. Holmes turned back to the railway timetable, cross-referencing the pencil marks with a small gazetteer he pulled from the bookshelf. His finger traced the branch line southward from London, through Guildford and Alton, down into the chalk hills of Hampshire until it arrived at Hartwell Cross, a dot so small on the map that Watson might have mistaken it for a speck of printer's ink. A village of perhaps 200 souls, Holmes murmured, situated in a valley of the North Downs, 3 miles from the nearest town of any consequence. The sort of place where everyone knows everyone, where the arrival of a stranger is an event, and where the departure of a man who has lived there for 30 years would not go unnoticed. He returned to the pressed flower, holding it between his thumb and forefinger with extraordinary delicacy. The petals were nearly translucent now, their color faded to a ghostly lavender, but the form was still intact, 5 petals arranged in a perfect symmetrical star. He pressed this flower with care, Holmes said. It was placed between the pages of his Bible, not randomly, but in the book of Psalms, which suggests it held a spiritual or deeply personal significance, a keepsake, a memory of the place he called home, carried with him on what he must have known would be his final journey. Holmes set the flower down on the table beside the watch and the map, and for a moment all 3 objects lay there together in the warm lamplight, the stopped watch, the pressed flower, and the unmarked map with its single emphatic cross. 3 relics of a life Watson was only beginning to understand, 3 clues left behind by a man who had trusted them to follow where he could no longer lead. The picture emerges, Holmes said quietly. Edwin Marsh, groundskeeper of Hartwell House, Hampshire, a man of advanced years, failing health, and unwavering loyalty. He discovered something at the estate, something that troubled him so deeply that he undertook a journey to London while gravely ill, carrying with him a map of the house and its grounds. He intended to bring this evidence to us, but death overtook him in a rented room in Bermondsey before he could complete his mission. Watson poured fresh tea for them both and settled back in his chair, cradling the warm cup between his palms. The fire had found its stride now, burning steadily and filling the room with a deep, generous warmth that pushed back the cold memory of the Bermondsey room and the still, peaceful face of Edwin Marsh. "What I cannot quite reconcile," Watson said slowly, "is why he chose you, chose us. If something was amiss at this estate, why not go to the local police? Why not write to Scotland Yard? Why travel 100 miles to Baker Street when he could barely stand?" Holmes nodded, and Watson recognized the gesture not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that the question was the correct one. The thread that, if pulled carefully, might begin to unravel the larger pattern. "Consider the possibilities," Holmes said, his voice calm and methodical, as though he were conducting a tutorial rather than investigating a death. First, and most obviously, Marsh did not trust the local authorities. In a village as small as Hartwell Cross, the local constable may well be under the influence of the estate's principal family. A man of Marsh's position, a servant, however senior, would understand the limitations of challenging his employer through conventional channels. He paused and steepled his fingers. Second, Marsh feared that his death, which he clearly anticipated, would be dismissed as natural and unremarkable. An elderly man dies in a rented room. It happens every day in London. Without something extraordinary to draw attention, the police would have recorded his passing, arranged a pauper's burial, and moved on. The message in blood ensured that would not happen. It ensured that his death would become notable, and that the one person in London capable of understanding its significance would be summoned to examine the evidence he left behind. "And third?" Watson prompted. "Third, and perhaps most importantly, Marsh knew my name. He knew my address. He knew specifically that I was the person to whom this evidence should be delivered. That suggests he had read your accounts of our cases, Watson, those published narratives that have made our address rather more famous than I might have wished. He read them and he concluded, rightly or wrongly, that Sherlock Holmes was the one man who would not dismiss his concerns, who would follow the trail he laid, and who would see justice done." Holmes fell silent. Outside, the first true light of dawn was beginning to seep through the gap in the curtains. a thin, pale line of gray that crept across the carpet and touched the edge of the Turkish rug. The fire murmured, the clock ticked. And somewhere in Hampshire, Watson thought, the estate called Hartwell House stood in the winter darkness, holding whatever secret had driven a dying man 100 miles through the snow. "We go to Hampshire," Watson said. It was not a question. Holmes looked at him across the table, and in the firelight his gray eyes held something that might, in another man, have been called tenderness. "We go to Hampshire," he confirmed. "First train from Waterloo. But first, Watson, finish your tea. It is going to be a long day, and Mrs. Hudson's tea deserves to be appreciated, not gulped." Watson smiled and drank. The tea was still warm. The fire still burned, and through the window, the first pale light of a winter morning touched the snow-covered rooftops of Baker Street with a quiet, silver grace. Chapter 5. A Morning Departure. They caught the 9:15 from Waterloo, the very train whose departure time Edwin Marsh had marked in pencil in his Bradshaws. Watson found something quietly moving in this symmetry, though he did not mention it to Holmes, who was unlikely to share the sentiment. The station was busy with the morning rush, clerks and businessmen in dark coats, a few soldiers in uniform, a governess herding 3 small children toward the Brighton platform. But the Hampshire branch line was quieter, and they found a first-class compartment to themselves. The train pulled away with a long, low whistle and a gradual gathering of speed that pressed Watson gently back into the upholstered seat. London began to recede, first the dense, soot-stained terraces of Lambeth, then the broader streets of Clapham, and then, almost suddenly, the city fell away entirely, and the countryside opened before them like a book. It was beautiful. Watson had not left London in several weeks, and he had forgotten how the winter landscape could move him, the sheer, quiet majesty of it. Fields stretched to the horizon beneath a covering of frost that caught the low morning sun and turned it to silver. Bare hedgerows lined the railway embankment, their twigs traced with ice that glittered briefly as the train passed and then disappeared. A river wound through a valley below, its surface dark and still, reflecting the pale sky and the silhouettes of leafless willows that stood along its banks like patient sentinels. The rhythm of the train was deeply soothing. The steady clack of wheels on rails, the gentle sway of the carriage, the occasional soft whistle as they approached a crossing. Holmes sat opposite, his coat folded beside him, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape with an expression of calm attentiveness. He had said very little since leaving Baker Street, but Watson could see that his mind was far from idle. Every village they passed, every church spire, every distant farmhouse was being noted and filed, incorporated into the growing map of Hampshire that Holmes was building inside his head. They changed trains once, at a junction Watson barely registered, and boarded a smaller, slower service that carried them deeper into the chalk hills. The countryside grew quieter, more intimate. The fields were smaller, bounded by ancient stone walls. Sheep huddled in sheltered corners, their wool dusted white with frost, and the sky above was vast and pale, stretching from horizon to horizon without interruption. Hartwell Cross Station was little more than a wooden platform and a painted sign, attended by a single porter who touched his cap as they stepped down from the carriage. The train continued southward without them, its whistle fading into the still winter air. And then there was only silence, the deep, clean silence of the English countryside in December. The village lay a quarter-mile along a lane that wound between bare chestnut trees, their branches silver with frost against the pale sky. Watson and Holmes walked in comfortable step, their breath visible in the cold morning air, the frozen ground crunching faintly beneath their boots. A robin sat on a gatepost and watched them pass with bright, unblinking eyes before launching itself into the hedgerow with a flash of red. Hartwell Cross was precisely the sort of village Watson had imagined. A small, handsome collection of thatched cottages and stone houses arranged around a green, with a Norman church at one end and a modest inn at the other. Smoke rose from chimneys into the still air, climbing in straight, unhurried columns before dispersing into the gray above. A dog slept on the doorstep of the post office. A woman in a heavy shawl carried a basket along the lane and nodded to them as she passed. The inn was called the Ploughman's Rest, and it offered exactly the kind of warm, unpretentious welcome that Watson had hoped for. They took a table near the fire, a large, open hearth where logs the size of a man's thigh burned with a steady, crackling authority, and ordered a late breakfast of eggs, bacon, toast, and strong tea. The food arrived quickly, served by a broad-shouldered woman who introduced herself as the innkeeper's wife and who regarded them with the frank, appraising curiosity that strangers invariably attracted in villages of this size. Holmes ate with more appetite than Watson expected, and between bites, with that effortless conversational skill that made him so formidable an investigator, he steered the talk toward the subject of Hartwell House and its residents. He did so with the casual air of a gentleman traveler making idle conversation, and the innkeeper, a ruddy, thick-armed man named Jessup, who had appeared from the kitchen, answered readily enough at first. But when Holmes mentioned the estate by name, something shifted in the man's expression. A wariness crept into his eyes, and his answers grew shorter, more careful, as though he were navigating around something he preferred not to say aloud. "Sir Reginald Ashcombe," Jessup said, in answer to Holmes's inquiry about the estate's owner. "He's been master of Hartwell House for 40 years or more, a good man, a fair landlord, but he's old now and not well. We don't see much of him these days." Holmes did not press the innkeeper. Instead, he allowed the conversation to settle and turned his attention to his tea, sipping it with an air of satisfied indifference that Watson recognized as entirely calculated. It was a technique he had observed Holmes employ many times, the deliberate withdrawal of attention, which invariably drew the other party back in, compelled by the very human need to fill a silence. It was not Jessup who broke, but another man entirely, a retired postman named Creighton, seated alone in the corner with a half-pint of bitter and a clay pipe. He had been listening to their exchange with undisguised interest, and when Holmes fell silent, the old man cleared his throat and leaned forward. "You're asking about the house," Creighton said, not accusingly but with the directness of a man who had spent decades walking the lanes of this village and knew its stories better than anyone alive. "And about Sir Reginald." Holmes turned to him with polite attention. We have business concerning the estate, a matter of some delicacy." Creighton studied them for a long moment, then nodded slowly as though he had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. "Sir Reginald has not been seen in the village since September," the old postman said. "Not at church, not at the harvest supper, not even at his own gate. His nephew, Mr. Leonard Ashcombe, says the old man is resting. Doctor's orders. But there's a new doctor up at the house, one none of us has met. The village physician, Dr. Penrose, was turned away at the door 3 weeks ago, told his services were no longer required." Jessup shifted uncomfortably behind the bar, but did not intervene. "And then there's Edwin," Creighton continued, his voice dropping slightly. "Edwin Marsh, groundskeeper at Hartwell House for 30 years or more. Good man, steady, loyal, quiet. He left the estate 5 days ago, walked out with nothing but a small traveling case and didn't say goodbye to a soul. That's not like Edwin, not like him at all." Watson glanced at Holmes, whose expression remained perfectly neutral, revealing nothing of the fact that they had stood beside Edwin Marsh's body only hours ago. "Leonard Ashcombe," Holmes said. "Tell me about him." Creighton took a long pull on his pipe. "He arrived at Hartwell House last spring, after being abroad for some years. Sir Reginald took him in. He's the old man's only living relative, his late brother's son. At first, things seemed well enough. But over the months, Leonard has taken more and more control of the household. Staff have been dismissed, visitors are turned away, and Sir Reginald has slowly vanished from public life, like a candle being covered with a glass. The fire crackled. The inn was quiet. Outside, the winter sun cast long shadows across the village green, and a church bell tolled once. A single deep note that resonated through the still air and slowly faded. Holmes finished his tea and set the cup down with a soft, precise click. "Thank you, Mr. Creighton," he said. "You have been most helpful." Chapter 6. Approaching the Estate. The lane to Hartwell House led them away from the village and into a landscape of quiet, rolling beauty. Ancient chestnut trees lined the way, their bare branches forming a latticed canopy overhead that filtered the pale winter light into patterns of silver and shadow on the frosted ground. A low stone wall ran along one side, its surface furred with moss and lichen, and beyond it, fields of rough pasture stretched away toward a line of wooded hills that marked the horizon. Watson walked beside Holmes in easy silence, his breath forming small clouds that hung briefly in the still air before dissolving. The only sound was the soft crunch of their boots on the frozen lane and the distant, intermittent call of a wood pigeon somewhere deep in the trees. The air smelled of cold earth and frost, and the faint, sweet decay of fallen leaves, the deep, clean perfume of the English countryside in winter. The house appeared gradually, as though the landscape were revealing it in stages. First came the boundary wall, high, well-maintained, of the same warm stone as the village cottages. Then the gates, wrought iron, standing open. And then, through a gentle avenue of lime trees, the house itself. Hartwell House was handsome. It was not grand in the way of the great aristocratic piles, no Blenheim or Chatsworth, but it possessed a quiet, proportioned elegance that spoke of centuries of care. Built of warm red brick with tall Tudor chimneys and mullioned windows, it sat comfortably in its grounds as though it had grown there, as naturally as the trees that sheltered it. Smoke curled from 3 of its chimneys, drifting upward into the gray sky with unhurried grace. A frozen ornamental pond lay to the south, its surface a perfect, unblemished mirror of white. Watson could see, even in winter, the evidence of the gardens that Edwin Marsh had tended for 30 years. The hedgerows were precisely trimmed, the gravel paths were clean. A walled garden to the west showed the neat geometry of dormant beds awaiting spring. It was beautiful, meticulous work, the kind of devotion to a landscape that takes decades to achieve and only moments to recognize. Holmes paused at the gate and surveyed the house with his characteristic thoroughness, his gaze moving from chimney to foundation, from window to door, missing nothing. "A house with secrets," he murmured. "They always look the most peaceful." Meeting Leonard Ashcombe. A manservant answered their knock and showed them into a wood-paneled study on the ground floor. The room was warm. A fire burned in a stone hearth carved with the Ashcombe coat of arms, and well-appointed, with deep leather chairs, a mahogany desk, and shelves of leather-bound books that gave the impression of learning without necessarily confirming it. A tall window overlooked the frozen garden, and through it Watson could see the walled enclosure where Edwin Marsh had once worked, its paths now untrodden, its beds still. Leonard Ashcombe entered a few minutes later. He was a man of perhaps 42 or 43, well dressed in country tweeds, with dark hair combed back from a high forehead, and features that were, Watson noted, conventionally handsome in a polished, practiced sort of way. His smile arrived quickly and did not entirely reach his eyes. He moved with the assured, fluid ease of a man accustomed to being in control of his surroundings, and he shook Holmes's hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Leonard said, as though the name were familiar to him. "And Dr. Watson, this is an unexpected pleasure. How may I be of service?" Holmes had introduced them as associates of the late Edwin Marsh, a description that was technically accurate if deliberately vague. At the mention of Edwin's name, Leonard's expression shifted. It was subtle, a fractional widening of the eyes, a momentary tightness at the corner of the mouth. But Watson saw it, and he knew Holmes had seen it too. "Edwin," Leonard said, recovering smoothly. "Yes, of course, a loyal man. He served my uncle for many years. I was sorry to hear of his departure. He left rather suddenly, as I understand it, for personal reasons." "He is dead," Holmes said simply. The room seemed to contract around the words. Leonard blinked. His hand, which had been resting on the back of a chair, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dead," he repeated. "Good heavens, how?" "His heart, it would appear. He was found in a lodging house in London." London? What on earth was Edwin doing in London? "That," Holmes said, "is precisely what we are attempting to determine. He left no explanation, but he carried certain items that connect him to this estate. We hoped you might be able to shed some light on his state of mind in the days before his departure." Leonard composed himself with visible effort and gestured toward the chairs. "Please sit. I will help in any way I can, though I confess I did not know Edwin well. He was my uncle's man through and through. Their bond was one I respected, but never fully shared." Holmes sat, and Watson took the chair beside him. The fire crackled softly, and Watson watched Leonard Ashcombe's face with the careful attention of a man who has learned that the most important truths are often found in the spaces between words. Leonard proved a cooperative host, answering Holmes's questions with an openness that might have seemed reassuring were it not so carefully maintained. He spoke of his uncle's declining health, of the decision to bring in a private physician, a Dr. Harding, recently arrived from the continent, and of the gradual reduction in household staff that he described as a necessary economy. He showed them through several rooms of the house with apparent willingness, pointing out family portraits and architectural features with the easy confidence of a man conducting a tour he had given many times before. But Watson noticed that their route was carefully controlled. Leonard led them along certain corridors and past certain doors, while steering them, with seamless misdirection, away from others. It was Watson who spotted the locked wing. They were passing through a gallery on the first floor, a long, handsome room hung with paintings and lit by tall windows, when he glanced down a connecting corridor and saw at its far end a heavy oak door fitted with an iron lock of considerable size. The door was closed, and unlike every other door they had passed, it bore no handle on this side, only a keyhole. "That wing of the house?" Watson said, keeping his voice casual. "Is it in use?" Leonard turned with a smile that did not falter. "My uncle's private quarters," he said. "He keeps to that part of the house entirely now, on Dr. Harding's recommendation. Rest and quiet, you understand. We keep it sealed to prevent disturbance. Even the servants do not enter without prior arrangement." "Quite understandable," Holmes said mildly. They moved on, but Watson caught the look in Holmes's eyes as they passed the locked door. That brief, intense flicker of focused attention that he had seen 1,000 times before, always at the moment when a case revealed its true shape. It was not alarm, not excitement, but something quieter and more certain. Recognition. The look of a man who has found what he was searching for and who understands with absolute clarity what it means. Holmes said nothing. He continued the tour with polite attention, asking Leonard about the history of the house, the age of the gardens, the provenance of a particular landscape painting that hung above the gallery fireplace. His manner was pleasant, unhurried, entirely unthreatening. But Watson knew. Behind that courteous mask, the machinery was running at full speed, and the locked door at the end of the corridor had become, in Holmes's mind, the center of everything. Leonard excused himself to attend to a matter in the estate office, leaving Holmes and Watson momentarily alone in the gallery. Holmes moved immediately to the window and looked out across the grounds, his reflection ghostly in the glass, his expression thoughtful. Before he could speak, a door at the far end of the gallery opened and a woman appeared. She was elderly, perhaps 65, with steel-gray hair pulled back beneath a white cap, and a face that bore the particular combination of dignity and worry that Watson associated with long-serving domestic staff confronted with circumstances beyond their control. She wore the black dress and silver chatelaine of a housekeeper, and her hands were clasped tightly before her, as though she were physically holding herself together. "Mr. Holmes," she said, and her voice trembled slightly. "I know who you are, sir. I have read Dr. Watson's stories. I was listening at the study door. Forgive me. And I heard you say that Edwin is dead." Holmes turned from the window. "You are Mrs. Garrett," he said. Not a question, but a statement of fact delivered with such gentle certainty that the woman's composure nearly broke. "I am, sir. I have kept this house for 27 years, and Edwin Marsh was my dearest friend in the world." Her eyes glistened, but she held herself firm. "He did not leave this house by choice, Mr. Holmes. He was dismissed. Mr. Leonard told the staff he had retired, but I saw him go. He was distressed. He told me—" She faltered, glancing toward the door through which Leonard had departed. "He told me that something was terribly wrong with Sir Reginald, that the master was being kept in that locked wing against his will, that the new doctor, Harding, was not treating him but sedating him. Edwin tried to speak to Leonard about it and was turned out that same afternoon. No reference, no severance. 30 years of faithful service, and he was shown the door like a common thief." Watson felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The peaceful house, the handsome grounds, the courteous nephew, all of it suddenly felt different, as though a painting had been turned over to reveal something dark and urgent on the reverse. "Edwin told me he would find help," Mrs. Garrett continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said he knew someone who would listen, someone who would understand. I did not know he meant you, sir, until this very moment." She reached out and gripped Holmes's hand with a strength that surprised Watson. "Sir Reginald is alive. I believe he is alive, but I have not seen him in 4 weeks. No one has, except Leonard and that doctor. Please, Mr. Holmes, Edwin gave his life trying to reach you. Please do not let it be for nothing." Holmes held her hand for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and steady and carried a quiet resolve that Watson found deeply reassuring. "It will not be for nothing, Mrs. Garrett. You have my word." Chapter 7. Pieces on the Board. The inn at Hartwell Cross was quiet in the early evening. The fire in the great hearth had been built up generously, and its warmth reached every corner of the small dining room, where Holmes and Watson sat alone at the same table they had occupied that morning. Outside, darkness had fallen swiftly over the village. A crescent moon hung low in the western sky, and the first stars were appearing, sharp, cold points of light in the vast, clear firmament above the Hampshire hills. Watson poured tea from a brown earthenware pot while Holmes arranged the evidence on the table between them, as methodically as a chess player positioning pieces before the opening move. The hand-drawn map lay in the center, its careful rendering of Hartwell House now fully intelligible in the light of what they had seen that afternoon. Watson could trace the gallery where they had walked, the corridor leading to the locked wing, and there, marked with that small, emphatic cross, the eastern section of the house where Sir Reginald Ashcombe was supposedly resting under the care of a physician no one in the village had met. Edwin drew this map, Holmes said, because he knew that words alone might not be sufficient. He wanted whoever received it to understand the physical reality of what was happening inside that house, the isolation of Sir Reginald's quarters, the single point of access through the locked door. He was a practical man, Watson. A groundskeeper thinks in terms of layouts, boundaries, paths. This was his language, and he used it with precision. Holmes touched the cross on the map with his fingertip. "Everything converges here. Edwin's distress, his dismissal, his desperate journey to London, the message in blood. He did not travel 100 miles to report a vague suspicion. He came because he had witnessed something specific, something that convinced him beyond all doubt that his master, the man he had served for 30 years, was in danger. Watson studied the map in the firelight, tracing the dotted paths that Edwin had marked through the gardens, imagining the old groundskeeper walking those paths in every season, knowing every tree and hedge and flower bed by heart, and then one day discovering that the house at the center of his world had become a prison. "The question," Watson said, "is what exactly Leonard Ashcombe intends." Holmes nodded slowly. "The question is not difficult, Watson. The answer, I suspect, is as old as inheritance itself." Holmes leaned back in his chair and spoke with the calm, measured precision of a man who has completed a complex equation and is now walking his audience through the proof. "Let us consider Leonard Ashcombe," he began. "He arrives at Hartwell House last spring. The prodigal nephew returned from abroad. Sir Reginald, elderly and generous, welcomes him. Leonard is charming, attentive, and apparently devoted. But within months, changes begin. Staff are dismissed, those who have known Sir Reginald longest, and are most likely to notice alterations in his behavior or health. A new physician is installed, not the village doctor who has treated Sir Reginald for decades, but a stranger, a Dr. Harding, whose credentials and character no one in the village can verify." Holmes paused, turning the pocket watch over in his fingers. "Sir Reginald is gradually withdrawn from public life. He stops attending church. He no longer appears at village functions. His correspondence ceases. Visitors are turned away. The eastern wing of the house is locked, and the only people permitted access are Leonard himself and the new doctor. To the outside world, the explanation is simple and sympathetic. The old man is ill. He needs rest. The family is taking care of him." "But Edwin saw through it," Watson said. "Edwin lived on those grounds. He knew the rhythms of that house as intimately as he knew the seasons. He would have noticed things that others missed. Curtains drawn at unusual hours, lights in the eastern wing at strange times, changes in the patterns of movement within the household. And at some point, perhaps he overheard a conversation, perhaps he witnessed something through a window. He became certain that Sir Reginald was not being cared for but controlled, sedated most likely, and kept in a state of dependency that rendered him incapable of managing his own affairs. To what end? The estate, Watson, the fortune. Sir Reginald is elderly, unmarried, and without direct heirs. Leonard is his only living relative. If Sir Reginald dies, or if he can be made to appear mentally incompetent, Leonard inherits everything. But if Sir Reginald were to recover his faculties, to speak to an outsider, to reveal what has been done to him, Leonard's scheme collapses entirely. The locked door is not protecting Sir Reginald's rest. It is protecting Leonard's secret." Holmes set the watch down on the table beside the map. Edwin understood all of this. He tried to intervene through direct conversation with Leonard and was immediately expelled from the estate. Denied the conventional channels of appeal, he did the only thing left to him. He packed his case, took the train to London, and set out for Baker Street. His heart failed before he arrived, but he had prepared for that possibility. He had, I believe, already accepted it. The map, the watch, the timetable, these were not personal effects carried out of sentiment. They were evidence, assembled deliberately, intended to guide us to this place and this truth. Holmes's voice softened. He wrote our address on that wall because he knew his body would be found and examined. He knew the message would be strange enough to attract official attention, and he trusted, that Sherlock Holmes would follow the trail. Edwin Marsh did not die in despair, Watson. He died in the act of completing his mission. The message was his final duty, performed with the same steadiness and devotion he brought to everything in his life. Watson sat quietly for a long moment after Holmes had finished, letting the weight of the deduction settle. The fire crackled. The inn's old beams creaked softly overhead, and outside, through the mullioned window beside their table, the sky above Hartwell Cross was alive with stars. More stars than Watson ever saw in London, a vast, silent multitude scattered across the darkness like grains of luminous sand. "It is remarkable," Watson said at last, not with the breathless astonishment of their early years together, but with the deeper, more considered appreciation of a man who has spent decades in the company of genius and has learned to recognize its most extraordinary expressions. Holmes shook his head gently. "I have merely followed the path he laid, Watson. Edwin Marsh did the difficult work. He observed, he understood, he risked everything. And when he was cast out, he did not surrender or despair. He acted. A man of limited means, failing health, and no powerful friends, and yet he found a way to ensure that the truth would not die with him." Holmes turned the pressed flower over in his fingers. That small, faded star of pale lavender that had traveled from the meadows of Hartwell to the pages of a Bible to the surface of a table in a country inn. "This is what courage looks like, Watson. Not the battlefield variety, though I mean no disrespect to your own distinguished service, but the quiet kind, the kind that asks no recognition, the kind that endures in silence and acts without fanfare. Edwin Marsh was, in every way that matters, a truly brave man." Watson looked out at the stars and thought about the room in Bermondsey, the thin curtains, the stopped watch, the steady letters on the wall. He thought about an old man lying on his side in the darkness, knowing that his heart was failing, knowing that he would never reach Baker Street, and choosing, with whatever strength remained, to write the address anyway, not for himself, for Sir Reginald, for the truth. The fire burned low, the inn was still, and the night, vast and starlit, held the village in its gentle, ancient hand. Chapter 8. Morning Justice. Holmes sent 2 telegrams before dawn, one to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard and one to the Hampshire County Magistrate, a man named Fellows, whom Holmes had assisted in a matter some years prior. By 9 o'clock, both men had responded, and by 10, a small, purposeful gathering stood at the gates of Hartwell House. Holmes, Watson, a representative of the magistrate's office, the village constable, and Dr. Penrose, the local physician who had been turned away from the estate 3 weeks earlier. Leonard Ashcombe received them in the same wood-paneled study, and if he was alarmed by the composition of the group, he concealed it with admirable composure. He listened as Holmes, in calm and precise language, outlined what they had discovered and what they believed to be happening within the locked wing of the house. Leonard denied everything, of course, smoothly, reasonably, with the practiced fluency of a man who had prepared for this moment. Sir Reginald was resting. Dr. Harding was a qualified physician. The locked door was a precaution, nothing more. But when the magistrate's representative produced the order granting access to Sir Reginald's quarters, Leonard's composure faltered. It was a small thing, a tightening of the jaw, a slight withdrawal of the shoulders. But Watson saw it, and he knew that the man understood his position, had become untenable. The locked door was opened. Behind it, a short corridor led to a comfortable but airless suite of rooms, where Sir Reginald Ashcombe lay in a large 4-poster bed, propped against pillows, his eyes open but unfocused. He was thin, far thinner than the portrait in the gallery suggested, and his skin had the pallid, translucent quality of someone who has not seen sunlight in many weeks. On the bedside table stood an array of brown glass bottles, whose labels Dr. Penrose examined with growing anger. "Chloral hydrate," Penrose said tightly. "Bromide, laudanum. This man has been systematically sedated." Sir Reginald stirred at the sound of voices. His lips moved. His hand lifted weakly from the coverlet, reaching toward something or someone no longer there. Leonard offered no resistance. He stood in the doorway of his uncle's room, his face pale, his carefully constructed world coming apart around him with the quiet inevitability of a house of cards touched by a single breath. Justice, when it came without violence or spectacle. It came in the form of a magistrate's order, a doctor's diagnosis, and the calm, implacable voice of Sherlock Holmes explaining, with surgical precision, exactly what had been done and why. Dr. Penrose worked quickly and with the focused determination of a man correcting an injustice. He reduced the sedation gradually, administered a restorative, and within an hour Sir Reginald's eyes had cleared enough to take in the room and the unfamiliar faces around him. He was confused, as anyone would be after weeks of enforced oblivion, but beneath the confusion, Watson could see intelligence. A keen, alert mind struggling to reassert itself through the chemical fog that had been imposed upon it. "Where is Leonard?" Sir Reginald whispered. His voice was thin and dry, like paper rustling in a draught. "He has been removed from the house," Holmes said gently. "He will answer for what he has done. You are safe now, Sir Reginald." The old man closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were clearer still, and something moved in their depths that was both pain and relief. The expression of a man waking from a nightmare and finding himself at last in a room full of people who wish him well. "Edwin," Sir Reginald said, "I want to see Edwin. He will know what to do. He always knows what to do." The room fell silent. Watson looked at Holmes and saw, for the briefest moment, something he had rarely seen on that angular, self-possessed face, a flicker of genuine sorrow. Holmes drew a chair beside the bed and sat down, bringing himself to the old man's level, and spoke with a gentleness that Watson found profoundly moving. "Sir Reginald," Holmes said, "Edwin Marsh is dead. He passed away 3 days ago in London. He had traveled there to seek help on your behalf, because he had discovered what was being done to you, and he would not allow it to continue." The old man's face crumpled. A tear ran slowly down his weathered cheek, following the deep lines that decades of laughter and sunlight had carved there. "He came to find you," Holmes continued softly. "He carried a map of this house. He carried the watch you gave him for faithful service. And with his dying breath, he wrote my address on the wall so that I would follow his trail and find my way to you. He succeeded, Sir Reginald. He saved your life." Sir Reginald wept quietly. It was not the dramatic grief of youth, but the deep, slow sorrow of an old man mourning someone who had been part of the fabric of his life for longer than most marriages endure. "Bury him here," Sir Reginald whispered, "in the churchyard beside the garden wall, where he can hear the birds." The afternoon train carried them northward through a landscape that seemed, to Watson, subtly different from the one they had passed through that morning. The same fields, the same bare hedgerows, the same distant hills, and yet everything was touched now with the particular quality of light that accompanies resolution, as though the world itself had exhaled and settled into a calmer arrangement. Holmes sat opposite, his coat folded beside him, his gaze directed out the window. His expression was peaceful, not the restless, searching look he wore at the beginning of a case, but something softer and more settled. The machinery of his mind had done its work, and now it rested, turning gently, idly, like a mill wheel in a slow stream. Watson watched the countryside pass, a farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney, a field of sheep, their wool bright against the dark earth, a church spire catching the last of the winter sun, its weathercock glinting gold for a moment before a cloud intervened. The rhythm of the train was deeply soothing. The steady clack of wheels on rails, the gentle sway of the carriage, the occasional long, low whistle at a crossing. Watson felt the tension of the past 2 days slowly releasing from his body, easing out of his shoulders and his neck and the muscles of his jaw that he had not realized he had been clenching. He thought about Edwin Marsh. He thought about a man packing a small leather case with a clean shirt, a Bible, a pressed flower, and a hand-drawn map, and setting out on a journey he knew he might not survive. He thought about the courage it took, not the loud, conspicuous courage of soldiers and adventurers, but the quiet, steady courage of a man who simply refuses to let a wrong go unanswered. The sun was setting as they neared London. The sky in the west turned soft shades of gold and rose, and the city's outline appeared against it in gentle silhouette. Spires and chimneys and rooftops, familiar as an old friend's face, welcoming them home. Holmes had not spoken for nearly an hour. When Watson glanced across at him, he found his friend's eyes closed, his breathing slow and even, and for once, just this once, Watson believed he might actually be sleeping. Mrs. Hudson had outdone herself. Whether by instinct or by some domestic sixth sense that Watson had long since ceased trying to explain, she had prepared a supper of roast chicken, potatoes, and winter vegetables that filled the sitting room with an aroma so warm and welcoming that Watson felt his eyes sting as they climbed the stairs. The fire had been built up to its fullest glory, fresh candles burned on the mantelpiece, and the tea tray, that faithful emissary of Mrs. Hudson's care, sat ready on the table with a fresh pot, a plate of shortbread, and a small vase of dried lavender that perfumed the air with a scent of summer. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that needs no words to sustain it. The chicken was excellent, the potatoes were crisp, the fire crackled and murmured its endless soothing refrain. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall again, soft, fat flakes that drifted down through the lamplight in slow, spiraling descents, as though the sky were gently returning the world to the state of grace in which this story had begun. Watson cleared the plates and settled into his armchair with his tea. Holmes moved to the window, where his violin lay in its open case, and lifted it with the reverence he reserved for the instrument alone. He tucked it beneath his chin, closed his eyes, and drew the bow across the strings. The melody that emerged was not one Watson recognized. It was slow and tender, written in a minor key that carried within it both sorrow and consolation, as though the music understood that these two things are not opposites but companions, that one cannot exist in its fullest form without the other. The notes rose and fell with the gentle inevitability of breath, each phrase resolving into the next, with a beauty that was almost unbearable in its simplicity. Watson listened and watched the snow fall. He thought of Edwin Marsh, and of Sir Reginald weeping in his bed, and of a pressed flower that had made its way from a Hampshire meadow to a table in Baker Street. He thought of the locked door and the blood on the wall and the watch that had stopped at 23 minutes past 2. And he thought of Holmes, this singular, impossible, irreplaceable man, standing at the window in the firelight, playing a melody for a stranger he had never met but whose courage he honored with every note. The music filled the room, the snow fell, the fire burned, and 221B Baker Street held its occupants in the warm, steady embrace of a home that had seen 1,000 stories pass through its rooms and would see 1,000 more. Watson closed his eyes and let the music carry him. Watson's final reflection. Watson opened his journal, turned to a fresh page, and wrote the date. Then he paused, his pen hovering above the cream-colored paper, searching for the words that would begin this particular account. They would come, he knew. They always did eventually. But tonight he was not in a hurry. Tonight the story could wait. He set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, watching the fire burn low. The flames had subsided to a deep glowing bed of embers that pulsed with a slow, warm light, casting long, soft shadows across the ceiling. Holmes had set aside his violin and settled into his own chair, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. Whether he was sleeping or merely thinking, Watson could not say, and it did not matter. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that does not merely signify the absence of noise, but actively creates something in its place. A space of warmth, of safety, of the deep and unhurried rest that comes only when the day's work is done and done well. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked its steady, faithful measure. The embers shifted and whispered, and outside the snow fell in its patient, endless curtain, covering London in a blanket of white that softened every edge and silenced every sound. Watson thought about the case and what it had revealed, not about crime or deduction, though these had played their parts, but about something larger and more enduring. Loyalty. The quiet, unglamorous loyalty of a man who tends the same garden for 30 years, who carries a pressed flower in his Bible, who walks 100 miles on a failing heart because someone he loves is in danger and there is no one else to help. He thought about how the world is full of such people, people whose courage is never recorded, whose sacrifices are never celebrated, whose names appear in no headlines and on no monuments. Edwin Marsh would have one monument now, at least, a grave in the churchyard at Hartwell Cross, beside the garden wall where he could hear the birds. And perhaps, when Watson found the words, another monument in the pages of the Strand magazine, where his story would be read by thousands who would never know his face but might, for a moment, understand his heart. The fire settled. Holmes breathed softly in his chair. The snow fell, and Baker Street lay still beneath its white December blanket. And the night, that vast, gentle, all-encompassing night, gathered the city into its arms and held it close. Watson's eyes grew heavy. The pen lay beside the open journal, waiting. The story would keep until morning. For now, there was only warmth, only quiet, only the soft, steady sound of snow against the window, and the deep, abiding peace of a world in which justice had been done, loyalty had been honored, and two old friends sat together beside a dying fire, needing nothing more than this. The night was kind, the night was still, and sleep, when it came gently,